prefer the way that comes out video wise. Cool. Right, welcome back everybody, whatever time of the day you choose to listen to this. Welcome to Move, Breathe, Live with me, Wibbs Coulson, Wibbs Yoga. Sometimes my wife, she's in the van. Today I am super stoked to welcome someone who I have been chatting to on and off for the last probably couple of months. I don't know where Dr. Matt Dewar you really came from, because you've kind of seem to have suddenly popped up, and actually the more I've kind of learned about you, the more I suddenly realized you're all in the same circles. And all of a sudden you just came out with, I think it was Robert Fortune, who, if you haven't listened, guys, go back. I interviewed him a while back and it was awesome. He sent me one of your posts and was like, check this guy out. He just tagged me or like HHPF in it. Check it out. It's really good. And then it was like, ooh. And then I've just been going through your posts, and yeah, I want to get into all of this in a minute. But first, I don't like giving intros to people because I think you'll probably do it better than I will. So I'm going to chuck it over to you for a minute, if that's all right. And you can just introduce yourself, name, I don't know, whatever you do, whatever you want to say, really.
For sure. Thank you for having me. First of all, it's
my
an honor to be here and talk. I'm an educator by trade and training, and I've been in a high school teaching environment for the last 19 years. And my job is really to look at how teachers, educators, and school environments can leverage the principles of social and emotional learning to help students not only optimize their ability to learn, but also optimize their well-being in the present and throughout the course of their lives. And so I'm the well-being coordinator for a school district, which means I've implemented a mindfulness program. I've done teacher self-care programs, all sorts of stuff to that end, because schools are really where we need this work.
Oh,
because
yeah.
We all know that the sooner you can intervene in someone's life with emotional skills and an emotionally supportive environment, the more you can really set their lives on a trajectory that leads to the outcomes that we want collectively as a society. And so that's where I kind of hang out professionally. But recently, just on Instagram, I've just been posting stuff related to breathing, because I'm also a breathing behavior analyst through Dr. Peter Litchfield's program. And so I've seen stuff online about breathing that maybe I push back on a little bit and offer an alternative perspective. And so I think that's where I kind of popped up in this breathing world. I suddenly appeared there. Whereas in the mindfulness and education world, I've been in that conversation, and now suddenly I'm in this other one because I've started talking about breathing.
Yeah, man. Like, I remember, so I when you popped up, and then I was kind of I can't remember where I read it, in all fairness, because I read it and then I heard you, I think you talking about it on one of your previous podcasts, but I remember reading it first saying that you obviously work with Dr. Peter Litchfield, and I have, I've looked at a few of his bits and pieces online. I first came across him when Brian and Rob had him on with Justin Feinstein, and they did like the stress molecule, I think it was, and they were just discussing CO2. And from both of these kind of fucking geniuses, you know, I mean, they've literally spent however long, 30 or 40 years, like studying breathing and physiology around it. And when I saw you working, I was like, that's where this is all coming together. I see that. That's cool. So yeah, one of the things I really liked, and this I think is probably what you were getting at with, you were saying you were pushing back a little bit, and you coming from a slightly different point of view of, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that you're kind of looking at it of breathing more of a, or less of a doing and more of perhaps a being, if that might be a reasonable way to put it.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's happened is that there is this belief that we can reverse engineer functional breathing just by changing mechanics.
Yeah.
or just by doing some sort of technique.
Yeah.
And I think what Dr. Litchfield has contributed to the field that's so vital is seeing that breathing and respiration are not the same thing.
Yes.
That breathing is
I really want to get into this. Yeah.
That's the paradigm shift, is that breathing is a behavior and respiration is chemical and it's reflexive. And if breathing is a behavior, it means it's subject to all the principles of behavioral conditioning that every other behavior is subject to. So triggers, rewards, payoffs, motivations, etc., which means we learn to breathe. And which really means we can learn to breathe in ways that do not serve our chemistry.
Yeah.
And so it's building self-awareness fundamentally of how, when, where, and why we take over our breathing. We've learned to breathe in ways that are a disservice to our respiratory chemistry. That is the key point. And that's the point that is usually completely missed. Yep. And we immediately jump to self-intervention techniques rather than developing self-awareness.
Amazing. And this is what for me, when the first few posts of yours I read, I was like, I see that that's where I try to come from when I'm in my class, because I don't know, everyone, well, not everyone, some people listening might know if they haven't tuned in. I'm a yoga teacher. I'm also a nurse. And I try to bring my yoga practices, like as far as my pranayama practice, my breathing, whatever. Yes, in my own body, my own practice, I dive fairly deep. But for most of the time when I'm teaching, like awareness is like 85-90% at least of the breathing work. And what I wanted to perhaps, bring up with you is the idea of maybe, you can perhaps just go into this, because I know, you've had some experience in a either ashram or a temple, or I'm not sure quite what the background was, but you've been to Korea, I want to say.
Yeah, I studied in college. I dropped out of school and flew to the other side of the world. And I lived in a Zen Buddhist monastery in Korea for 4.5 months.
Yeah. So where I kind of come from, and this is perhaps where, and I kind of feel there's this missing gap, and I feel this is where you're maybe stepping into, is the fact that in this breathing world, we've got yoga people, let's say, who don't really understand the physiology and are teaching things, and to be fair, awareness around breath, but they're teaching breathing things without really understanding perhaps the knock-on effect physiologically. And then there's the breathing people who are coming in with this let's do things to correct things. And actually in the middle there's this missing piece of awareness, but with the understanding and the scientific background. So you've got the Eastern, and this is where I feel like the Eastern things start from a better block, mostly that actually awareness comes first. And for me, that's where I am trying to lead from and come into. And that's obviously where with you, it's completely what I felt I saw with you. It was like, you can tell in my eyes, I felt I could tell that there was something a little bit Eastern around your practice, a little bit more spiritual, if you like.
For sure. I definitely, even though I work in a secular world and I work with secular mindfulness and secular breathing practices, I still practice in the Zen Buddhist tradition. So I still have a daily practice, which involves sitting Zazen 60 minutes a day. Mm-hmm. And then I do a handful of retreats a year. So I'm definitely personally invested in that particular practice and have derived a lot of benefit out of it. But professionally, there's just a lot of scientific research about breathing and about mindfulness and attention and the neurobiological mechanisms that underpin how we pay attention and how we breathe and the interrelationship between the two. that I've explored for years now. And to go back to what you were just talking about, and I'm going to speak in generalizations here.
Yeah.
So I want to preface that these are generalizations. So I don't want to offend people, because breathing
offend them. Fuck 'em.
Breathing has turned into the new kind of nutrition community where everyone's hanging out in a camp.
Yes.
And they defend kind of their territory, and which is unfortunate, because that's not a place where we can learn collectively together and advance breathing as an art and as a science. But generally speaking, I think what I've noticed, and this is just what I've noticed, right, is that on the one side, you have people who are practicing in, I've seen a lot in the yogic tradition, or in the yoga tradition. And I think one of the big issues I've seen repeatedly in that area with breath work is a conflation of disassociation with relaxation, that people think disassociation is relaxation. And it's because people who are practicing yoga aren't paying attention to real-time respiratory chemistry and the impact of different breathing techniques on PCO2 levels specifically. And so one of the things that happens when we breathe, when we take over our breathing consciously, one of the things that often happens is that it crashes our carbon dioxide levels. And we do this unconsciously as a mechanism for survival, is that we overbreathe, we take deep breaths. And I did a post or a video where I was hooked up to a Capno trainer a couple weeks ago, and I had the software running, and I showed people in real time what deep breaths do to crash CO2, right? What's important is that when CO2 crashes, it has an anesthetizing quality to our somatic experience, which means we stop feeling our body.
Yeah.
And so many people in different yoga circles interpret that as relaxation or calm or insight of some kind. But in reality, it's kind of like the same effect you would get from alcohol.
Or shooting up heroin or something.
well, yeah. I mean, with alcohol or any kind of sedative, where you're numbing, you're muting bodily somatic sensation and experience.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why that happens. And within a specific context, it makes sense and it's probably helpful, because you don't want to have to feel your body if something bad is happening to it.
Yeah.
But most of the time that's not happening to people. And so we end up taking unconsciously these bigger breaths, and we're over breathing and we're dumping our CO2, because it allows us to escape having to deal with certain emotions and stress in general. And when we do that repeatedly over time, what we're doing is we're allowing our zone of regulation from a respiratory chemistry standpoint to migrate down. Down, so that we only feel normal when we have very low PCO2 levels. And at some point, there's a basement to that, where people start to get really immediate and intense symptoms that come on, because you're reducing so much blood flow to the brain when you hang out in those areas. And so basically what I'm saying is that when you chronically overbreathe, and you set up your sense of normalcy as being lower and lower and lower, you're always hanging out right above total physiological dysregulation, which means your buffer for stress is essentially non-existent. So you can go from being okay or disassociated to having all sorts of symptoms or fainting very quickly. And that's a problem. And so people who practice yoga, who I've hooked up and worked with the machine, almost always overbreathe.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just very briefly on that note, when you've pushed it so low at the same time, then if you've kind of got the risk of passing out, you've almost got that lowering, but then, coming out of the top as well, like the fear, the anxiety, the panic of like pushing the CO2 suddenly too high again, when you've bottomed it out so much, again, just compounds and confounds that whole sense of feeling that you've had. And when that happens, you suddenly, do you know what I mean? That's going to just force you down into that lower space even more, because you're going to be, well, every time I try to do that, if I try to slow my breathing, it's worse. I panic the fuck out, and then I have to, I'm safer and I'm happier in this place here, not really understanding that this is so low that actually it's, as you say, so close to kind of complete dysregulation.
And what you're describing is exactly what Brian McKenzie and Rob Wilson have done such a good job bringing to people's attention, is the way in which our sensitivity to CO2 is increased the longer we're habitually hypocapnic with low CO2, right?
Yeah.
And so their work has done an excellent job identifying that, right? And finding ways in the performance setting to figure out how to boost that, to re-regulate our sensitivity to CO2. What you just described too is maybe the most important part. And that is, there are different habit types that form in breathing behavior as a learning phenomenon. And a type 1 habit is when a particular event triggers a certain kind of breathing behavior. So that's a type 1 habit. A type 2 habit is when the breathing behavior triggers certain symptoms.
Okay,
and a type 3 habit is when those symptoms trigger additional symptoms. And so when you're working with someone, they come to you as a mess because they have type 1, type 2, and type 3 all layered on top of each other.
Yes,
and so
exactly.
You have to be able to pull out and figure and untangle what is happening and get back to that type 1 habit. What is the original event that triggered the learning in the first place? Because if you don't control that stimulus, the breathing behavior will continue. This is what's so important in the performance side of things, where everyone's focusing so much on techniques, is that even if you become a master of techniques, so apneas and different breathing ratios, and you improve your CO2 tolerance, all that's great, but it's occurring within a narrow scope, and you cannot assume that the advances you make in that narrow scope that you're using to evaluate improvement, that it's going to generalize to baseline breathing behavior all the time. Most of the time it does not. You can, in fact, I see this all the time with athletes who they do breath holds, they improve their CO2 tolerance, they do all this stuff. It helps them with a CrossFit workout. And then when they're done and they go back to baseline breathing, unconscious learned breathing behaviors, they're as hypocapnic or more hypocapnic than they were before.
And this is exactly what I was going to say, is like, there's obviously a time and a place, and if that's your thing, brilliant. But it comes back to the idea of like, we have to begin to find awareness. And if we're going to in any way write all this stuff, and going back just a few more minutes before, but when you said about hooking up the yoga people to the capnographer, and you suddenly go, there you go, I want one of them, man. I want one of them. I just want to play. When you hook these people up, and you suddenly realize that there isn't the awareness of body and breath that, especially in the yoga people, because I did a chat with Patrick McEwen, and he was asking me about yoga, and he said, but why is it in yoga everyone breathes so heavily? You're constantly like doing this strong, like noisy ujjayi breath. And I was, I don't know, like, especially in the Ashtanga world and whatever else, it's just what is taught. Do you know what I mean? It's a noisy, rhythmical breath that you can move to, that I guess you can keep focus on. So it keeps you present, I guess, perhaps. But it's such an over breathing type breath that, again, I kind of feel, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but the way that you've kind of described it is actually almost you're anesthetizing your body, and then you're taking that feeling of like otherworldliness, if you like, as being otherworldliness rather than being anesthetized.
Yeah, there's a difference between the clarity and calm that comes with physiological regulation. That is very different than numbness that comes from disassociation caused by dysregulated physiology. And because people lack self-awareness and they don't understand the difference between the two, they conflate the two, and they take it as progress. And what ends up happening is the only time they feel normal is when they're doing yoga, or the only time they feel normal is when they're exercising. And then the rest of their life, they increasingly feel anxious and they feel all sorts of things. And so it becomes a self-perpetuating process, because then you say to yourself, well, gosh, the only time I feel okay is when I'm doing yoga. That's when I feel so calm and centered and all these things. And it's really just disassociated.
That's so bang on. I've written a few posts, not in many ways you just described it and written it better than I did, but like the amount of people who will go to a yoga class and they can only do like yoga in that like setting where everything's perfect and the candles are smelling nice and the joss sticks there and the music's perfect and they've got some tingly bells and stuff, and it's that whole thing where they get to step away and they get to, I don't know, I think it's the way they breathe there, like, just puts them into that state of mind. And so that therefore that's the only time they feel relaxed. If they try and do anything at home, they can't do it because it's not the same as being in that environment. And I think that's bang on. I think just the way you said it there was spot on.
Yeah, it's and this comes from my background in mindfulness. As a practitioner of mindfulness as well, is that often the only thing that we need is the awareness. That the system knows how to self-correct if you give it awareness. And one of the things that is a product of a sustained mindfulness practice is the ability to recognize when there is unnecessary effort in your experience. Your experience in general, and your breathing specifically. And anytime there's effort, there is emotional content. There is unnecessary emotional content driving your patterns of attention. And this is so important, because if we don't develop this fundamental awareness of somatic experience, somatic sensation in the body drives behavior and decision-making. This is what's happening all the time. Every moment of every day is that certain states emerge within the field of our experience, somatically within our body. We unconsciously assign value to those states of arousal based on previous experience. And we create forecasts of what that likely means. So then it compels us to act in conditioned and habitual ways as a result. So we make decisions accordingly. And this is why I always say, what appears in your mind does not originate there. Let me say that again. What appears in your mind does not originate there. Once something enters the stage of conscious experience, right, comes out from behind the curtains of unconscious experience, then we're like, oh, I'm making this decision to breathe this way, or I'm making this decision to open the fridge and eat this particular item of food, we have no awareness of the fact that it, just because it appears in your mind doesn't mean it originated there. It originated in your physiology, but you were completely unaware of somatic experience. And so the whole pattern of conditioning just plays itself out.
I mean, that just sounds like kind of a couple of Sapolsky's books kind of, coming into life in many ways. And yeah, that whole idea of, your environment and your subconscious constantly taking those cues, and actually you having consciously no awareness of it, and actually that triggering you, more that triggering you before you've even had a chance to do your breath work. Do you know what I mean? And that's where I think, as you're saying, this idea of having a killer breath practice, but you hook up to a capnographer and you suck balls, and yet do you know what I mean? You can have the best practice, but if the smallest thing, then if you haven't built the awareness of the kind of somatic awareness and feeling, you're going to be constantly, as you kind of use the word, triggered or whatever else, without consciously knowing it. You're going to always have these things coming back to bite you in the ass.
So in the field of instrumental learning, this is called stimulus control. If you don't develop awareness of the stimulus that generates behavior, then the behavior will persist.
Yeah.
And so if you reverse engineer the behavior through, so let's not talk about behavior in general and be abstract. Let's talk about the behavior of breathing specifically, right? So breathing's a behavior. If you try to reverse engineer dysfunctional breathing just through techniques, just through,
protocols and
all the things that you see on Instagram that everyone's just posting about all the time and whatever. And so all of that will likely do nothing to change the underlying patterns of conditioning and learning that have occurred in relation to the stimulus that generated the learning in the first place, the behavior in the first place. And so Dr. Litchfield always says, trying to understand breathing without trying to identify the psycho-emotional content that is the stimulus for breathing behavior is like trying to understand a computer by only looking at the hardware and the operating system, but paying no attention to the software.
Yeah.
You have to understand the software running the programming.
Yeah.
That's the stimulus. And that's the type 1 habit, right? So let's, for many people, this might be too abstract. Let's give it a concrete example. I was working with someone who's a CrossFit athlete, not in the CrossFit games, but they're in Masters CrossFit. And they came to me because they experienced their chief complaint in coming to me was exercise-induced breathlessness. That at peak levels of exertion, they found this experience of breathlessness to be disorienting and overwhelming. And as a result, it drove their heart rate up. It created irregularities in their breathing, and they couldn't perform at that upper level of exertion. So long story short, we come in, we're doing an assessment. When you're doing an assessment, as a breathing behavior analyst, you're always looking for emotional content. You're always looking for the type 1 habit. What's the event? What's the stimulus that triggered the breathing behavior, right? And so we're talking, and his focus is on the present problem, which is the exercise-induced breathlessness and fear and panic.
Yeah.
So I asked him the question, which is a great question to ask anyone when you're opening a conversation about breathing history. When in your life did you first notice breathing in general or breathing as an issue? Okay. So he tells me a story. He tells me that between the ages of 7 and 12 years old, he had multiple episodes of croup. Croup is what little kids get, where their throat closes up and they can't breathe.
Like a barking noise.
He was rushed to the emergency room multiple times because his mother feared that he was going to suffocate and die. The last episode, he had croup. His mother, instead of calling an ambulance, got into the car, turned on the air conditioning, and sped in the middle of the night to the hospital, holding his head and face up to the air conditioning vent in the car so that the flow of air would prevent him from suffocating, which any well-intentioned mother in the moment seems like, right, it would work. So as I'm listening to this, immediately what pops into my head is what, especially in relation to his chief complaint.
Hang on, sorry, my dogs have just come and got me.
No.
Sorry, so I've got a dog nosing my face. So what would come in? I don't know.
He's coming to me saying
With
his
breathlessness,
issue
essentially
is
breathlessness at high.
correct. And
Yeah.
this guy's done oxygen advantage. He's done apnea protocols. He's done all this stuff, right, to help with this particular issue, right? And it remains a problem, okay? So he's telling me that this is his problem, that exercise-induced breathlessness and panic is his problem. But when he tells me that story, I realize the problem has nothing to do with exercise. Exercise is just an event that is triggering the physiological learning that took place when he had croup.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he learned to fear breathlessness. Breathlessness equated to death, which in our species in general, suffocation is a huge threat. And so we have all these alarm systems, physiologically speaking, to alert us to potential suffocation. But so I said to him, do you think that has any relevance to your issues with exercise-induced breathlessness? Right? And so all of a sudden, we're making a connection. So what if you learned to tell your body and your physiology when you're reaching that state, instead of thinking that you need to freak out and accelerate your breathing, what if you could just be there and trust that your physiology will be okay?
Yeah.
And that it knows what to do without you taking over.
Without you fucking it up.
I'm like, so why don't we try that? Guess what happened?
He probably felt bloody wonderful.
He felt great. He had a breakthrough. His heart rate went. He was always wondering why at higher level workouts, especially with running workouts, why his heart rate was so unnecessarily high. Because he's got this background level of panic going on where he's taking over his breath. And so when you do apneas and exercises like that, all you're doing is reconditioning the underlying learning of taking over your breathing.
Yeah.
Even though in an apnea, technically you're slowing down the rate of breathing, you're allowing CO2 to build up, et cetera. I get it. But when you zoom out, it's reinforcing the underlying psycho-emotional content. And so all he needed to do was develop an awareness, an explanation for why he was breathing the way he was breathing, and an awareness of how he was doing it.
Yep.
And then trust in his physiology that he didn't need to take over. He could let go and let his diaphragm take over without engaging his
auxiliary muscles. And and so from there, then that then would set him up with all of the other work he's already been doing. That's then you suddenly get the benefit of all of those apneas and those fucking protocols and stuff.
Sure.
That can then come in, and this is where I feel the way you kind of have been sort of saying this, and what I feel like I've been trying to get across. I'm pretty shit at putting shit on Instagram in any kind of formalized manner, but in the same way of like, actually all of this work, there's nothing, it's not bad to do this work, and in many ways it will have huge benefits for you if you can build an awareness out first.
That if is huge.
Yes, exactly.
That if is huge.
And this is and this, going back to more of your other work, is what's so important with the teens, the school kids, the whatever else. It's like, if you can bring this whole group of people who, I mean, fucking, let's face it, like, I would not want to be a teenager growing up these days. I just wouldn't. But the amount of shit that's going on, and yet we're then expecting them just to deal with it without any awareness. And so if we can build an awareness within, I guess, kids and teenagers, then hopefully it's going to set them up later in life.
Absolutely. And whenever I'm speaking on like panels at education conferences, et cetera, people often refer to like the young adult mental health epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm at the place now where, not trying to be rude, I'll just say to people, we need to stop talking about the young adult mental health epidemic. And we need to start talking about the adult mental health epidemic, because young adults and children live in the world that we created.
Mm-hmm.
And they are a mirror. Their well-being is a mirror right back to us and our conditioning and our learning and our choices and our level of skill or absence of skill. And so we've improved in the last 10 years, where finally we're in a place where, for the most part, parents, teachers, and coaches will talk about their kids' well-being, we'll talk about their students' well-being, and we'll talk about their athletes' well-being. That's a big shift in the right direction. 10 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case. It was very hard to get anyone to talk about young adult well-being. So now for the most part, I think we're pretty good in that category. What's still not happening is that parents, teachers, and coaches still will not talk about their own well-being.
Yeah.
And that is the big problem, because we are social. The brain is a social organ. The brain is a social organ. The reason why we have a human brain is because of social evolution. And that we made this trade-off at some point in our evolutionary history, where we allowed for this hyperplasticity that we have, that allows us to learn and adapt and evolve and be creative and restructure the world in all these novel ways. That came at the cost of prolonged dependency. Mm-hmm. And the only way dependency can happen is through social connection and emotional safety. And that's all through the cueing of nervous systems of adults who are the caretakers of children. And for 100,000 years, our genes were shaped in tribal environments of 50 to 75 people, where we grew up with primary caretakers deeply invested in our well-being, providing cues of safety. Because when we're infants, through the mother's face, through the muscular patterns and expressions on the mother's face, we're generalizing the safety of the total environment. Right? And so a part of that, and I'm not going totally off tangent here, a large part of that is co-regulation through breathing, that we learn to mimic our mother's breathing at a very, very early age. And Stephen Porges, who's the creator or founder of the polyvagal theory, he created a term called neuroception. And it's this idea that our nervous systems perceive the state of other nervous systems. And the reason why he doesn't call it perception is because perception suggests a conscious level of recognition, whereas neuroception is an unconscious reading of other people's nervous systems. And if this is the huge insight of social and emotional intelligence research, is that the person of influence in any situation establishes the emotional climate and tone with their physiology. And so if we're in a position as a teacher, as a leader, as a parent, as a coach, that how we breathe, how the facial expressions we allow to inhabit our faces, our body language, the inflection of our voice, all of these things communicate the status of our nervous system and have implications about the larger world that we represent to young people. And so it's just so important at a young age, if one, adults can be self-aware and self-regulate. So first and foremost that, and then two, in doing that, that's why it's called social and emotional learning, is because we learn emotional skill in a social context.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
and so that's really the most important part is providing social environments of connection and safety, and then teaching young people skills that when they become dysregulated, they can learn to bring themselves back into a state of regulation. And breathing is such a critical physiological process and tool that can be leveraged to that end.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I mean, I guess on that thing, it's kind of like, how the hell do we even go about starting, if it's hard enough kind of trying to potentially get into schools as you are and whatever else, and work on the young adults, because at least in that situation, there you've got a whole group of people the same age in one place. Do you know what I mean? Like how you go around trying to, well, hopefully this kind of stuff, like if there's any benefit to social media and the like, is hopefully being able to put information like this out and get adults to realize that actually their neuroception, how they're neuroceptually, if you like, spreading their, or making their children aware of their nervous systems. Because I mean, I've got numerous people who follow me and contact me and speak to me, and when they're constantly trying to dig to the bottom of their anxieties and their panics and whatever else, and then their kids are all having sleep whatever the word is, sleep pattern disorders and all, and then they're getting worried about, and you can kind of see how the adults' take on the world is beginning to inform, along with obviously, how we're feeding kids and whatever else these days, but suddenly feeding into the children's own nervous system makeup and their ability to hopefully deal with things in the future.
The environment that we lived in, that our genes were primarily shaped within, consisted of reliable and consistent inputs that create physiological outputs, right? I mean, again, instrumental learning, right? The environment provides stimuli that program physiology to predictably respond in certain ways. And those ways either work and a species perpetuates itself and continues, or the species adapts and learns to change in some way, or it perishes. And so we've had this environment that we were shaped in with certain inputs that elicit physiological responses for so long. And suddenly within the last however many, I mean, you could go back to agriculture 10,000 years ago and say that's really the start of it. But let's just say very recently, in terms of evolutionary time, we've completely changed the inputs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And really in the last 20 years, I mean, really in the last 10 years, there have been such the cognitive environment that we live in terms of the types of information we're consuming and the rate at which we're consuming it, is unprecedented from an evolutionary standpoint. And it's causing a lot of deep dysregulation in our biology and also in our social world, and the interface between our biology and our social world. And so, yes, it's very hard to be a parent today. It's very hard to be a teacher today.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And it's very hard, as you said, to be a young adult or a child today, because we've lost connection with a clear sense of what are the circumstances within which we can self-regulate, and then layer a pandemic on top of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
where we're designed as human beings, our number one way to self-soothe in the face of stress is to lean into social connection.
Exactly.
And you're in a pandemic where your biggest threat is social connection.
Yeah.
So it's this dissonance of our instincts.
And then also on top of that, the ability to be outside. I don't know how it's been really in America, but like certainly over here during during the worst of the lockdowns, it's, you know, you're locked up in your house. If you've got a garden, you're lucky. But do you know what I mean? The ability to be outside in fresh air, in nature, to actually, you know, be able to see a full skyline and get that sort of neural input of like big, wide, open, you know, full vision, wide angle views, which is going to help you calm down and relax. You know, all of this stuff, which again, it's been hardwired into us, and then all of a sudden for the last 18 months, like, nah, fuck off, can't do that. You're going to, like, you got a bit sit inside with your two, you know, your mum, your dad, and your sister, and you can't go and see anybody else for the next 6 months. Yeah, it's super hard, man. It's super hard.
One of the things you learn in educational psychology is how do you create educational spaces that create safety and belonging, right? Mm-hmm. Because safety and belonging create neurobiological states that are prerequisites for optimal learning.
Yeah.
Right. And creativity, memory recall, et cetera. And one of the things they talk about in educational psychology is what's called serial processing. And that's the serial processing is the automaticity of behavior in a consistent environment. So when your environment's consistent, you can automate behaviors cognitively, so you don't have to spend unnecessary or undue effort. Thinking about brushing your teeth or putting on your shoes or whatever. And so you want to create classrooms where kids know that there are predictable and reliable routines when they come in, so they don't have to think about, like, where am I going to sit? Who am I going to sit with? Well, just assign a seating chart. Because if you do that, then the kid knows I'm just coming in and I'm sitting here, and it's not because this person's not talking to me or whatever. You've just eliminated all of that. Yeah. So with COVID, if you generalize the principles that help create an optimal learning environment and a safe learning environment in a classroom to a society, COVID has wreaked havoc on that, because we have to go around and we have to think twice or 3 times or 4 times about some of the most mundane and simple features of our experience that previously we never had to give any consideration to.
Yeah.
And that is terribly stressful.
Yeah. And if you look at then how then going back to where we were, and, you know, even if this is, you know, if this is the main stress, if that's something which has completely blown you out, and then how that's then going to affect your breathing, which then might well then have is going to probably have a knock-on effect to your respiration. And then you've suddenly, do you know what I mean? If you're that whole mega fear of being around people with, you know, with or without masks, and going into shops where everything's too small, too tight, you know, someone coughs, do you know what I mean? That could well be enough to then force you into that poor learning habit of poor breathing.
Yeah. And masks. And this isn't a comment about whether.
Yeah. Let's not get political about it.
Should or shouldn't wear masks. But in schools, at least here in Illinois, where I live, the governor mandated wearing masks inside everywhere, but also within schools. And we don't teach students how to breathe with a mask on.
Yeah.
And that's really important, because we have these innate and ancient mechanisms that protect us from suffocation or alert us to threats of suffocation. Yeah. When you put something over someone's face, even though it's actually not disturbing airflow, right? It's a psycho-emotional trigger to overbreathe.
Yeah.
Just having it there is going to create anxiety and overbreathing. And so you've already got a stressful environment because of the pandemic. You've got being a teenager in 2021, which is already increasingly stressful. And then you put a mask on, and your number one physiological process to mitigate stress is now becoming dysregulated, because you're unconsciously fearing suffocation and overbreathing. And now you got a bunch of kids who are further dysregulated because of their breathing. And then we're throwing them in classrooms and saying, learn content and curriculum like you always do.
And probably from a teacher who's also wearing a mask, where you can't read his face, you can't see what's going on. You've kind of completely lost all of that, like body language cues. And so actually, do you know what I mean? That's even more stress if he says something or she says something in a slightly off way and you can't read their face, you're going to take it potentially more personally and then overbreathe further and harder and then spiraling down.
Yeah. And as mammals, one of the ways in which we neuroception takes place and we co-regulate and create emotional stability and safety, again, is the face and the muscles in the face and the expressionality of the face.
Yeah.
Is so vital, so that when I'm talking to you, I feel that you're understanding me and you're hearing me and you're receiving my emotions transmitted through my language. Yeah. Like you're nodding your head right now and you're doing all sorts of things that say, hey, he understands me right now. Yeah, and then when you talk to me, hopefully I'm doing the same thing, and it allows us to co-regulate and we start mirroring our physiological processes. And they've studied this, that I will then start mirroring your breathing and you will mirror mine. And even things like blood pressure and heart rate will start to sync. And this is wonderful, but you put a mask on. And again, I'm not saying masks are good or bad or whatever.
Not political, guys, not political.
I'm just saying real consequences of having a mask is you cover a lot of the expressionality of the face, which can make it very difficult to co-regulate. So if you're a teacher and you typically use the expressionality of your face to soothe your students, that's a really important tool that you've lost to create that sense of calm, which is, again, the prerequisite for learning.
But, and then, again, not being political, but then, not having the awareness. I'm going to come back to the word awareness, because really I kind of feel this talk has all been awareness, but coming back to the awareness of like however high you want to go, WHO, whatever, but not having the awareness of perhaps how the mask might impact something as simple as expressionality on young kids, adults, teenagers, whatever else, then, not that I'm not saying you could have bypassed it or whatever else, but if there'd been more awareness around it, actually you could have potentially come up with some ways to mitigate some of the additional stress to these people who are already overly stressed, let alone physiologically what's happening with the mask and the overbreathing and this, blowing off too much CO2 and the chemoreceptors and all of that kind of jazz. But yeah, it's just, again, just that kind of, when you're in a pandemic, you're probably not really thinking about that too much, but in hindsight, I guess for the future, it's the sort of thing that really, if we can begin to have more awareness about the mental health side of these things, or the physiological side, let's say, because really mental and physical health, I think, are going to go hand in hand. But like, if there's a better awareness around it, then actually we could probably help to bypass and mitigate a lot of these issues that the youngsters are going to have, and then hopefully stop them having to take it into their adult life.
Yeah. The goal of enduring a pandemic is to survive.
Yeah.
And so I recognize that, right? That's an important goal. I mean, that is the number one goal of physiology, not to self-actualize or optimize. Those are wonderful constructs, that we've created and layered on top of survival. But survival is the name of the game. Yeah. But it's always, as human beings, because we have the brains that we have, we can ask the question, survival at what cost?
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of having a human brain, is we can do a cost benefit analysis of what it means for a given behavior and its success in the present moment, and what the cost of that behavior will be over time. And so sometimes, and this is really the distinction between what a good habit is and what a bad habit is that a bad habit prioritizes immediate rewards and displaces the cost to the back end, and a good habit does the opposite.
Yeah.
And so, hindsight is 20/20, and I think everyone deserves a pat on the back and a hug, a
Yeah.
socially distanced
Distance,
hug.
yeah.
Whatever.
We can do that in the UK now, by the way. We can pat and hug and do all sorts of shit these days. So
We're good. You guys are going crazy.
I know.
But everyone deserves some leeway. Everyone
Yeah.
deserves some emotional leeway, because we've never been through this before, and we're all so different, and our conditioning and learning is so different. And we've learned to deal with threat in a myriad of ways. And so everyone is doing the best that they know how to do.
Yeah.
I think that's so important. That's one of the really core insights of being an educator and working with students all the time, is you realize that every student, and generalize that to every person, is really doing the best they can do with what they've learned, how they've learned to be in that particular moment. They are exactly as they've learned to be.
Yeah.
And so
with everything that life's thrown at them, that's exactly where they're at.
And so be kind and compassionate, and give some leeway. So anyways, I won't get lost on that.
Well, I mean, I can't believe that we've knocked over an hour already. To round up then, I tend to, I always ask my guests to, if you could give someone in, a minute and a half, whatever, like a really simple takeaway that they can try to put into their life. Like I say, this is Move, Breathe, Live is the name of the podcast. So it's something that might help them move, breathe, to hopefully live a happier and healthier, and maybe a little bit more present life. If they're going to listen to this and take one thing away that to go and have a little practice with, what could you suggest? I'm throwing this on you here. I meant to tell you at the beginning, but I'm always fucking shit at remembering to tell people. So it's more of just a pick it out the top of your head.
I would say, make stillness and quiet your friend.
Cool.
I think that stillness and quiet are endangered dimensions of experience. And it's only in stillness and quiet that we are able to regain the perspective that makes our lives worthwhile, living our lives worthwhile. And we're so hyper addicted to doing the next thing and consuming the next piece of information that we are losing context on what it means to be a human being. Mm-hmm. And why we're here and what's possible to experience. And one of the things I've talked a lot about recently with students in the past couple of years is I encourage them to learn to pay attention to the fewest things that yield the most emotional value. Let me say that again.
Yeah, say that again.
Learn to pay attention to the fewest things that yield the most emotional value. Right? If you're going to design or engineer a life, identify what's important, what's worth paying attention to, principle-based or value-based attention, and then orient your life around that, your attention. And that will serve as a counterweight to the entropy, the attention entropy that occurs via social media, via technology, via the design of 21st century life. And I really see that being the biggest threat to everything that affronts our individual and collective well-being, is the entropy of attention.
Yeah.
There's something sacred and whole about whole attention, that to be in the presence of the world fully with full attention is the most special and sacred act that any of us can do. To stand before the world or another person and be fully present. Yeah. That's it. That's the name of the game. So I'll stop there.
I'm gonna ask one more on that point then, because I completely agree, by the way. But one of the biggest things people like to say when you say find stillness and find quiet is they say, I can't. My brain's too busy. My brain's too noisy. So if someone was to say that to you, what would you reply?
That's okay. That's just where you are. and it's not stillness and quiet make your brain busy. It's that noise is always already going on in the background. And in your day-to-day life, you don't notice it because you seek out equal or greater noise externally to neutralize it, which is why stillness and quiet are so important, is because they allow you to confront what it is you've created in your inner environment, your internal environment. And if somatic sensation in your internal world drives behavior and decision-making, and the outcomes that are important to you in your life are the product of that decision-making, doesn't it make sense to get acquainted with and learn to skillfully navigate that inner world and those sensations so that that whole causal chain can ultimately lead to the outcomes that make your life worth living? So if it's noisy and busy and crazy and chaotic, here's the thing. I say this to students all the time. We're all crazy. Everybody's crazy. So when you sit down and you witness the conditioning of your own mind and internal world, and you're like, whoa, what is going on? That's everyone. We're all crazy. And we've always been that way. And that's the beauty of mindfulness, is it teaches you that you don't need to take ownership or responsibility over whatever appears in your mind. You need to take ownership and responsibility of how you respond to it.
Your reaction to it.
Yeah, that's the key point.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for doing this. As you can see, it got dark while I was sitting out here, but it's bloody beautiful. So that was such a great chat. Thank you so much for coming and joining me.
Thank you for having me.
If you can briefly let people know where they can find you, any of your work that you're doing. I know you've got a new book out. We haven't even mentioned that, but feel free just to chuck it out. I'll put everything in the show notes so people can get it in their own time. But where can people find you?
So I just, the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens came out August 1st. It's available any major bookseller, Amazon, etc. And people can find me on Instagram. It's at Dr. Matt Dewar, and then on LinkedIn, Matt Dewar, EDD.
EDD, perfect. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming and joining me. It's taken us about 3 or 4 weeks to get here. We finally did it. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'll look forward to maybe doing it again sometime in the future and chatting some other stuff.
Sounds good. I really appreciate you having me on, and I hope you have a good rest of your night.
Thank you so much, Matt.
All right. Take care.